Savage Bites, Episode 22. Ghosts of Tafarn Ceg. The multiverse exists in profusion, its dimensional facets endless yet ephemeral. What we call reality is in truth as diaphanous and transitory as a dream, for that is all it is, a dream of existence. A delicate glimmer of consciousness flickering momentarily in the dark, imprisoned within the isolated confines of a human skull. 100 billion discrete elements combined and intertwined, precisely ordered and encoded into the intricate synaptic pathways of a 4-pound hunk of grey meat. I'd never heard of Tafarn Ceg until the day I saw it for the first time. My post as police detective had led me to the little hamlet, which lay at the very fringes of my jurisdiction, hidden among the rocky crags of an inhospitable stretch of coastline somewhere, I won't say exactly where, along the westward reaches of North Wales. I was charged with investigating the disappearance of a lighthouse keeper by the name of Anderson, a Scotsman who had, I was told, been reported missing from his post several days before. I had quite a trial finding the place, oddly absent as it was from any map, online or otherwise. After wasting some time in a wild goose chase up and down the narrow lanes of the hilly region, I resorted to ad hoc roadside inquiries, enlisting the help of the few locals I came across on those seldom frequented back roads. In this manner, I was eventually able to piece together directions to a place evidently shunned by the introspective residents of the surrounding region. I finally found my destination, tucked away at the termination of a rutted track that bore no sign. It wound down through a bleak, sheer-sided valley to a hidden cove, where a dozen cramped fishermen's cottages huddled, exposed to the ravages of the slate-grey Irish Sea at the base of a crumbling cliff. I rolled onto the hamlet's single, narrow, cobbled street late that afternoon in a sudden sheeting downpour of rain, such turns in the weather being typical to the region. On arrival, I was nonplussed to find the lighthouse tender out of action, her laconic skipper bluntly asserting that she had engine troubles, and that we needs must take the trip out to the isolated rock by means of an old rowboat kept in reserve for such emergencies. Inclement weather and a ruffled sea boded ill for such a journey to my mind, even though the distance out to the light was comparatively short. But there was nothing else for it, so, with a reluctant heart, I stepped gingerly into the dory while the skipper and his mate made ready for the off. I was tired after my laborious drive, dead tired, but the brisk salty air enlivened me, rousing me from my contemplative lassitude. It was cold and wet in the little boat. The offshore wind was fresh at my back, the rain lashing us on our way out to sea. The damp timbers creaked in complaint as my companions methodically plied the oars, urging the little craft ponderously out into the cresting brine toward our unseen destination. I felt sick to my stomach, the unpredictable rolling motion of the boat stirring up my insides to a distressing degree in the foaming swell. The sharp brackish tang of the air only accentuated the burgeoning sensation of queasiness. My weary eyes roved to the horizon, questing the gloom for some reliable landmark by which to steady myself, breathing deeply, sucking in cool air to hold my seasickness in check. And there it was, the lonely island, surmounted by the squat pinnacle of the circus lighthouse, its attenuated form half lost amid drooping veils of sombre rain. It was late afternoon, yet it felt more like midnight under the piled black cloud that hung oppressively over the little boat as she reared and nodded at the mercy of the waves. A foghorn sounded distantly, from somewhere out in the gloom, like the woeful lowing of some great cetacean cow, its tone underscoring an air of despondency creeping over me amid the dour tableau of cold, craggy, slate-grey sea. As the horn died away, it was answered, seemingly, by a distant chorus of queer, plaintive cries of an ill-determined nature, seabirds perhaps, or the communicative utterances of seals. It was difficult to define their nature or origin, but their sorrowful lament was eerie in the extreme, and their continued susurration only served to further set my nerves on edge. Just then, a glimmering coruscation flickered at the horizon. Abruptly it came, that brilliant sword of light. Rapidly circumnavigating the lost horizon, it hurtled toward me, its blinding white heat momentarily searing my optic nerve as it swept past. Here was my destination. I clambered ashore some time later, and leaving the boatman to tend to the dory, I ventured inland. Shivering with cold and soaked to the skin from rain and sea spray, I scrambled up the natural fortification of algae-slick rocks, finally trudging the narrow path between the heather up to the summit of the islet. The lighthouse hunkered at its rocky peak, a tight cluster of heavy structures brutally cast in steel-reinforced concrete, whose exterior was weathered to a degree that rendered it almost indistinguishable from the Ordovician dolerite of the crag that formed its pedestal. The tower was squat and heavy-set. A metal dome supported by a ring of rusted astragals crowned its apex, thin projecting fingers of iron that held the storm panes in place against the weather. Hidden within, the automatic mechanism continued its monotonous task, its gear wheels revolving, swinging that warning blade of light through its arc, scanning the restless benighted seascape with relentless regularity. The square block of the engine room projected from the base of the tower, the distant rattle of its diesel motor reaching my ears intermittently on the gusting wind. The opposite side being flanked by the brute concrete cube of the keeper's quarters, connected to its parent by a narrow umbilicus of iron walkway projecting from roof level. I made for the door, deep set at the base of the damp, mottled concrete facade, whose weathered surface was blank save for a row of narrow mullioned windows set at even intervals along the upper edge. The door itself stood partly ajar, and I entered, blinking into a dismal corridor intermittently lit by a single flickering phosphorescent tube that clung to the high ceiling in a tattered veil of webs. The narrow way led me to an ascending set of metal steps, at the top of which lay the keeper's apartment. Inside it was sparse and unkempt, the tiny kitchen a mass of filthy dishes, ripe with rotten leftovers and scattered with empty plastic packets and tin cans. In the sleeping quarters, the bedsheets were stained, the beds themselves unmade, the bare floor strewn with dirty laundry. The office and cramped sitting room were likewise dishevelled, the former littered with an incomprehensible chaos of loose, handwritten papers, indited in a cramped, illegible cursive, of which, for the life of me, I could make no sense. The place was a study in disarray, the portrait of an existence devoid of order or discipline, of a mind in decline. Yet there was, so far, no sign of the missing keeper himself. My search led me up to the roof and across the iron gantry to the lighthouse proper, whose exterior door, though closed against the elements, remained unlocked. The smell inside the tower was atrocious. The sticky tang of marine putrescence, so unlike the hearty sea salt breeze so many associate with its seaside. Finding an old tissue in my overcoat pocket, I held it to my nose as I ascended the concrete spiral that wound up to the top of the tower, clinging warily to the cold metal rail pinned along the wall for fear of falling. The precarious ascent lacking any kind of protective central balustrade that might prevent one from plummeting down into the gloom far below. As I completed the first turn of the spiral, my hand lighted on something hard clinging to the rail. On inspection, I found it to be a barnacle, and it was not alone. Odd as it is to say, the cold, bare wall was dotted with them, and looking up, I found their profusion increased, until the whole wall and much of the spiral stair itself was thickly encrusted with them. There was seaweed too, hanging in great folded fronds, glistening wet from the steps overhead and trailing down in hanging creepers. It was surprising and most disconcerting. How could such things be? How could they get here? And how could they survive for so long outside their natural subaquatic habitat? It made no sense, yet here it was, and I redoubled my care as I traversed the increasingly treacherous surface they presented through the final arc of ascending steps. The service room at the top of the stair, which resided one story down from the lantern room, was similarly embellished, its interior more closely resembling a sea cave than anything else. The mechanical workings were still operational, as evinced by the continued circuit of the light outside, despite a partial encrustation of barnacles and draping weed, but it seemed likely to me that, if the situation were left to continue unchecked, the operation of the light would be interrupted before long. The lantern room above had fared little better, the ubiquitous fishy odour pervading here also, its floor being partly carpeted by the encroaching mass of intractable crustaceans whose seemingly irresistible progress had infringed as far as the storm panes, and had even violated the sanctity of the Fresnel lenses that made up the lantern itself. As I canvassed the cramped space, those curious distant cries I'd first heard from the boat reached my ears anew. Eerie it was to hear them alone in such a desolate place, even for a man well accustomed to the grisly, disturbing side of life. On a whim, I ventured outside onto the iron-railed gantry that ran around the top of the lighthouse in order to listen. Perhaps I hoped to catch sight of the elusive thing whose voice I heard. But in this regard, I was disappointed, though the singing cry continued, rising and falling on the wind. For the life of me, I could not define it. One moment it held all the character of a lingering animal cry, the next modulating its tone to adopt the dour melodic drone of a religious litany. It was queer and unsettling in the extreme, and it seemed as though the more I focused on it, the louder and more insistent it became. Shaking my head to clear it, I stepped back inside, and satisfying myself that the place was otherwise vacant, I beat a careful retreat down the tower, eager to escape as quickly as possible the invasive cloying stink and those ghostly vocalizations. I was, I'll admit, somewhat overwrought and temporarily at a loss as to how I should proceed when, upon reaching the level of the gantry, I noticed that the spiral steps continued downward at the further edge of the barnacle-flecked concrete platform. I rarely go anywhere without a light, and this proved fortunate as I proceeded into the dim obscurity beneath the foundations of the tower. Just where the continuation of the steps would lead, I didn't for the moment know, but I deemed it only prudent to examine all avenues of investigation in my efforts to find the missing keeper. What I expected to find down there, I cannot say. Some manner of storeroom, perhaps. What I did find was surprising and outlandish, and what subsequently unfolded tested my nerves and my resolve to a degree and in a manner I'd never encountered, never dreamed I'd ever encounter in all my years on the force. I followed the worn steps down into the dark, flashlight in hand, its frail beam carving out a narrow cone of attenuated light in the all-encompassing blackness. Soon the character of the steps changed, the uniform cast concrete I'd come to expect giving way to older dressed stone blocks that clearly represented evidence of an earlier construction. Some way further down, I arrived at an old iron-bound door. It stood ajar, its bottom edge firmly jammed against the uneven surface of flagstones, where a heavy chain and corroded padlock lay discarded. The gap left by the door proved just wide enough to squeeze through, and a little further on those dressed stone steps too were replaced, the neatly ordered flight devolving into a meandering series of steep, unevenly spaced ledges cloven into the living rock itself, and I was forced to my hands and knees in my efforts to clamber down them. I couldn't tell you to what depths my descent took me. That I lost count of those crooked steps somewhere just short of 300 attests as much to my fatigue as to my worrisome mental state. In time the steps opened out, terminating in a broad cave mouth, its lip a precipitous ledge overlooking from a high vantage point, a vast dome-like cavern whose rough-hewn bulwarks gleamed iridescently with a ghostly greenish phosphorescence. Here was something wholly unexpected, something unprecedented. I was determined to explore it in the hope of finding my missing charge. It seemed not unlikely that somewhere in the spectral vault below I might find him. Perhaps he had been the one to unlock the iron-bound door, and subsequently find his way down into this hidden grotto. Perhaps he was here still, lost or trapped or injured, or dead. My descent to the cavern floor proved both hazardous and time-consuming, impeded as I was by the treacherous nature of the route, which was little more than a shallow ledge etched into the arching walls, its staggered path circumnavigating the circular subterranean grotto at an inclined angle that eventually wound down to ground level. It was a foolhardy climb looking back. One missed step would have been enough to send me flailing to calamity on the rocks below. But I persevered, and eventually my freshly scuffed Oxfords touched down on a strip of smooth rock at the edge of the cavern floor. A great dark body of water dominated the space, and I could tell by its salty tang and by the ponderous swell and sag of its shifting surface that it was in submarine communication with the sea. At the margin of the water, not far from where I alighted, lay a body, its lower section half submerged in the lapping surf. This had to be the keeper. Taking a knee beside it, I gently rolled the body over onto its back, pulling away the slick tangle of pulpy weed that entwined it. The moment my hand touched him, I knew he was dead. He was cold. Cold as the Irish sea that caressed him in its swell. His donkey jacket and shirt were open at front, exposing the chest. The skin there was pale and puffy, and mottled at the ribs, with an intricate pattern of discoloration that at the time I took for the onset of decay, though now I have my doubts. The face was turned away from me, a curious film of jelly-like emollient slathered across the head and neck, obscuring the features. I reached out, gingerly pulling the chin toward me, and as I did so became aware of an intense and persistent high-pitched whistling in my ears. The sound worked on my mind, narrowing my perspective, cutting me off from the outside world, bringing with it a claustrophobic tightening of focus, fixing my undivided attention on the waterlogged corpse before me. Seen through the milky refracting lens of the jelly, the face reminded me of an alabaster bust, though there was something oddly familiar about its features. Clearing the bulk of the jelly away with the edge of my hand and scooping the eye sockets clear, the face was revealed, and I recoiled in confusion and nihilistic skepticism, collapsing onto the bare rock in supine rejection of what I'd seen. At the sight of my own face. What was this? How could this be? I was perplexed and frightened, all at once doubting my senses and my sanity. It was impossible. Yet there it lay, and I beside it, staring my own death in the face in the most literal, corporeal way imaginable. As I looked on in growing perturbation, the eyes flickered open. Milky white, sightless, dead eyes. My breath caught in my throat at that. Then the throat moved, as though in the action of swallowing. The mouth sagged open then, and from within emerged a fat, pale, semi-translucent louse, a marine isopod the size perhaps of a black rat. The thing detached itself from its host, creeping languidly over the lip and chin, and onto the corpse's mottled chest. I watched it aghast, paralysed in loathing and disgust. Then, as I watched it, it seemed to become aware of me, its primitive faculties detecting my presence. It made for me, advancing at speed across the slick stone floor. Before I knew it, it was on me, scuttling across the back of my hand and up my sleeve. I pawed at the thing with my free hand in frantic revulsion, sweeping it away onto the floor, but not before it sank its razor-edged mandibles into the meat of my arm, leaving it bleeding. In an active fit of hysterical detestation, I stamped the thing flat on the rocks, its guts bursting out, staining the surface beneath it with a revolting yellow ichor, and emitting a poisonous stench that brought the bile into my throat. There was a movement in the water behind me, as I stood there breathing hard, a furtive splashing that roused me from my hectic trance. But when I turned to look, there was nothing to be seen but a ripple of foam swirling and parting on the leaden brine. Suddenly, I was moving, my body seizing control, while my mind was overwhelmed with frantic speculations. I fled, scrambling back up the precarious path in a flood of hysteric terror. Looking back, I swear I saw them in the water, a multitude of domed heads bobbing in the brine, their eyes gleaming in the half-light cast by those eerily phosphorescent walls. That arduous climb passed in a tide of delirium. The next thing I remember was staggering out of the lighthouse and collapsing on the bare rock of the islet as the storm raged about me. My fingernails were bloody, my clothing scuffed and torn at the knees, but I was alive and sane. Just what had happened down there in the dark, I wasn't certain. Had I indeed met my doppelganger, or some ghostly counterfeit? Had I imagined it all? Or was I merely mistaken? Had the queer circumstances of my quest influenced me in the formulation of an erroneous conclusion? I was overwrought, my nerves badly shaken. I concluded that the best course of action now was to quit the islet and return to shore and report my findings. But the boatmen were nowhere to be found. Clambering to my feet, I performed a circuit of the tower, stumbling over the heather and the barren wind-swept rocks in a vain hunt for the boatmen. My search accompanied by the return of that elusive, haunting cry that had so far dogged my visit. Try as I might, I could not locate the missing men. Instead, my fruitless search led me to the discovery of another, a solitary female figure, half naked and perched atop a craggy finger of rock jutting out into the sea, where the waves broke violently at the behest of the storm. She turned at my approach, her dark eyes meeting mine. her pretty face expressing a recognition I could not reciprocate. She smiled, her eyes dancing with life, her flowing auburn hair lifting and flailing in the driving gale, like a halo of dull flame. Raising my voice above the clamour of the wind, I asked her who she was, and what on earth she was doing out here in the storm. She looked crestfallen at my initial question, tears budding in her eyes. She wondered if I didn't recognise her, and was clearly distressed when I answered in the negative. She reached out and took my hand, bidding me kneel beside her. "I'm your sister," she asserted. "Don't you remember?" "I have no sister," I replied blankly, rather taken aback. A movement caught my eye then, something broad and flat shifting in the shadows a few feet away down among the rocks. A sudden, insane suspicion took me, and reaching out swiftly, I tugged at the seaweed draped across her lap, revealing the glint of silver scales. I staggered to my feet, my head swimming in tense confusion, my heart racing, that unearthly song rising suddenly, wailing deafeningly in my ears. I awoke in bed, warm and dry, my face crushed into a downy pillow, thick sheets enfolding me. A lamp glowed on the stand next to the bed, dimly illuminating a wing chair perched beside the casement. Outside the storm raged on, its full fury muted by the presence of the glass. There was a dull click, and the door opened, admitting a middle-aged, homely-looking lady in cardigan and apron. She seemed surprised and pleased to find me awake, and said so. She carried a tray with her. Pulling up the chair, she placed the tray on her lap and proceeded, slowly and carefully, to spoon-feed me a creamy chicken broth. It was only when I awoke again later, in the pitch darkness of the small hours, that I noticed that I was firmly strapped to the bed. The storm had abated, only to be replaced by that eerie, half-animalistic chanting, coming from somewhere out in the night beyond the casement window. A shadowy figure loomed at the foot of my bed, just a dark smudge amid the grey. It stood static and unflinching as my anxious inquiries turned to hysterical screams. Dr. Anderson stuffed the last clump of salmon-decked nigiri into his mouth, chewing gratefully, enjoying the enlivening zest of wasabi. He'd been on shift for 14 hours, and this was the first bite he'd had all night. He washed it down with the last remnants of a can of flat Coke, wrinkling his nose in mild disgust. He should have clocked off 5 hours before, but as usual, he'd stayed on. Still, it was almost time to go home now. Just one more visit before he left for the night. He stepped briskly onto the psychiatric ward, nodding curtly to the two burly hospital porters who were just leaving. He caught the duty nurse's attention with a cocked eyebrow. She was just finishing up his patient's customary blanket bath as he entered. "How's our detective doing tonight?" he inquired, casting an appraising glance over the vacant-eyed patient propped up in bed for... "Any response to this evening's physio session?" She shook her head. The low drone and measured beep of medical equipment scored the scene, accompanied by a disparate ensemble of fitful snoring from some of the other patients. Occasionally, one or other of them would cry out plaintively, tormented minds lost in turbulent, Valium-fueled dreams. The doctor perched at the edge of his patient's bed, his added weight inducing a rocking motion. Leaning close, examining those empty, unfocused eyes, he was, even after 3 years of attentive treatment, still amazed and perplexed by this vacant hull of a man. What had happened to him to induce this state of protracted torpidity? He couldn't say. Scant details were known regarding the man's final hours of lucidity. Thorough testing had proven there were no physiological factors involved that might explain his unfortunate condition. Evidently something had occurred that had pushed him over the edge of reason. But what? Somewhere out in the corridor beyond the ward, the floor buffer thrummed into life, its high-pitched whine echoing along the hall. Anderson coughed a gust of sushi breath into his balled fist, drawing a penlight from the top pocket of his lab coat. There was a noticeable reaction as he directed the bright beam into his patient's eyes, the pupils contracting sharply in the glare. But it elicited no further feedback. The man remained as unresponsive as ever. The doctor shrugged, standing erect, his eyes still fixed on his enigmatic patient, lost in his own perplexed musings, frustrated at his inability to help him. He stepped aside as the nurse returned to administer the patient's evening medication, a hefty injection jacked into the fat, bruise-and-haloed vein at the crook of the man's left arm. He turned at the measured clip of stilettos on the polished tiles, greeting the newcomer with a sympathetic smile. She wished him good evening, still formal even after 3 years, her voice soft and melodic, and edged with a tone of resignation. Her dark eyes and shy, tight-lipped smile expressing a sense of helplessness and regret, sentiments he shared. She took the wing chair beside her brother's bed, a silver clutch laid in her lap. He noticed, incidentally, that tonight she wore her long auburn hair down, in contrast to the neat business-like bun she typically sported, and wondered what it meant, if it meant anything at all. She inquired how her brother had been, and he was unable to do more than inform her that there had been no change, for better or for worse. She was weeping openly by the time he'd completed his remarks, leaving him feeling awkward and impotent, and he made a halting attempt to allay the worst of her misgivings, explaining that there was still a chance he could pull through, that it was not unknown for patients in his condition to make a full recovery. She nodded curtly, her expression hardening as she wiped tears from her eyes with the heel of her hand, and he got the distinct impression that she wished to be alone with her ailing sibling. He was exhausted, and it was time to get out of there, to go home and get some sleep. He bid her good night, awkward and self-conscious in the face of her naked grief, and made his way out of the psychiatric ward. Exiting the room, he noticed, not for the first time, a distinct and peculiar fishy odour in the corridor. But he dismissed it, almost certain its source must have been the sushi he'd eaten for supper. You have been listening to Ghosts of Tafarn Ceg, Episode 22 of Savage Bites, with me, Christian Bravery. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. It's something of a love letter to H.P. Lovecraft's Shadows over Innsmouth, mashed up with the feel of the 2017 movie Ghost Stories, written and directed by Jeremy Dyson and Andy Nyman. My denouement being highly influenced by that movie, as you can probably tell. I dare say there's a touch of Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse in there somewhere as well as Cold Skin, also from 2017. The sea has always held an air of mystery about it, the seashore representing the border between the known and the unknown. Themes of the sea and the location of the sea has been really prevalent in horror for a long time. It was a huge theme for Lovecraft, as we all know. That kind of alien nature of sea creatures really disturbed Lovecraft, and his revulsion for it really bled out into the whole of the horror genre in a really big way. I really wanted to do something in that vein with this episode, within the framework of the Psychological Horror Month. I hope you think it was successful. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and please share it with anyone you know who might be interested in horror stuff or anything like that. And yeah, I'd be really grateful if you could do that. Yeah, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.